Tonight, we're going to be speaking about Ukraine and about taking a new lens that might help move toward resolution of that conflict and of also the division within Ukrainian society. And our guest is Nicolai Petro, who is a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island. He was a U.S. Fulbright scholar in Ukraine in 2013 to 2014 and was also there last year while on sabbatical from URI. He's the author of the forthcoming book, The Tragedy of Ukraine: What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. Dr. Petro, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. So I thought it'd be worth talking about what happens after the conflict ends, precisely because there's so much talk about what's going on right now. Despite the fact that Russia's invasion has thrust the geopolitical aspect of this conflict into the spotlight, I am convinced that it is the domestic conflict there which is the real key to bringing the current cycle of tragedy to an end. And to understand why, we need to see the present tragedy as not one, but three interrelated conflicts. The first conflict is the result of America's long-standing efforts to detach Ukraine from Russia's sphere of influence. The roots of this geopolitical tug of war go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and his thesis that Ukrainian independence, which occurred in 1991, can serve as a geopolitical pivot for transforming Russia. Since this idea was first articulated in 1997, it has become a cornerstone of US foreign policy. As the longtime president of the National Endowment for Democracy, an American-funded influence organization overseas, Carl Gershman, he put it on the eve of the 2014 Maidan revolt, quote, "Ukraine is the biggest prize. If it can be pulled away from Russia, then Putin may find himself on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, but within Russia itself," said Gershman, end quote. The second conflict stems from the clash of visions in Russia and Ukraine over the nature and extent of Ukrainian sovereignty. In Russia, hostility to Ukrainian sovereignty is driven by the fear that the far right, which has grown significantly in influence since 2014, will transform Ukraine from a friendly neighbor into anti-Russia. In Ukraine, by contrast, hostility toward Russia is fueled by fear that the failure to draw a sharp enough distinction between the two nations will prevent the emergence of a Ukrainian national identity. As former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko said last year, if Russians and Ukrainians are one people, then the Ukrainian people do not exist, end quote. But to my mind, the most important conflict still remains the conflict within Ukraine itself, between its historically Russophile East and its historically Russophobe West. This conflict has been going on for at least 150 years and has erupted in serious military hostilities inside Ukraine at least 3 times during the First and Second World Wars and after the 2014 Maidan. It should be noted that in each instance, violence was exacerbated by the intervention of foreign powers seeking to tip the scales within Ukraine for their own advantage. Resolving this internecine conflict would therefore go a long way toward removing the ability of foreign actors to intervene and stoke the other two conflicts. But it would also require a new level of dialogue, compassion, and mutual reconciliation among Ukrainians themselves. Any hope of such a reconciliation taking place in this generation, however, would seem dashed by Russia's 2022 invasion, which has reignited the civil war in Donbass and thus renewed the cycle of tragedy. In the selfish and narrow-minded pursuit of its own national interests, Russia is trying to impose neutrality and federalism on Ukraine, hoping to thereby reverse its disadvantages in all three of these conflicts simultaneously. In the strategic conflict with America, by forcing the United States to take heed of what Russia calls its red lines. In the bilateral conflict with Ukraine, by ending NATO's military plans for the country, and in the domestic conflict, by restoring the balance of interests between Eastern and Western Ukraine to what they were before 2014. As a result of this use of brute force by Russia, many analysts are now predicting that Ukraine's domestic conflict will soon be a thing of the past, that the crucible of war with Russia is forging a new and more united Ukrainian nation. This is not a new argument. Indeed, it has been the hope of several Ukrainian government officials since 2014, when Ukraine's interior minister, Arsen Avakov, asserted that war with Russia would have a, quote, salutary cleansing effect on the nation, end quote. Yet, when asked in July of 2021 what they thought of President Putin's statement that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, 41% of Ukrainians overall, and nearly 2/3 in Eastern Ukraine, said they agreed. The fact that hostility toward Russia is currently at an all-time high in Ukraine can therefore not be taken as an indication that it will be so for years and decades to come. One need only think of how dramatically relations have shifted over time between England and Ireland, Mexico and the United States, or France and Algeria. Perhaps there will be a permanent shift in the mentality of Eastern Ukrainians as a result of this war. But if the past 8 years are any indication, then a fundamental values reorientation of what I call Russophile Ukrainians away from Russia seems unlikely. It is worth noting that while positive attitudes toward Putin and the Russian government have fallen sharply since 2014, personal sympathies for average Russians much less so. And even as the Russian language has been effectively forced out of the public sphere, it remains the language of choice in schools, in publishing, in entertainment, and in internet usage in every region of the country, except the three westernmost regions. As the pro-Maidan journalist Vitaly Portnikov put it earlier this year, quote, as long as Ukrainians and Russians cry over the same television shows, the president of Ukraine is definitely Vladimir Putin, not Vladimir Zelensky, at least for a vast number of Ukrainians, end quote. Another conundrum that many Western analysts preserve not to delve into too deeply is what to do with the people in Donbass and Crimea, most of whom no longer want to be part of Ukraine. This is corroborated by numerous Western polls, as well as by internal polling done by the Ukrainian government and leaked to the Ukrainian press. Given their mutually exclusive claims, the nightmare scenario facing Ukraine is at the front line of the new Cold War between Russia and the West will now cut directly across its territory, prolonging the conflict there indefinitely. I once described the conflict over Ukraine as reminiscent of the dilemma faced by King Solomon in the Bible. Only instead of being like the woman who relinquished her claim to a child in order to save its life, Russia and the West are both acting like the woman who would rather see that child torn asunder than let the other have it. How can we avoid this nightmare scenario from happening, particularly now that the sides are engaged in a full-blown military conflict? By removing Ukraine as a source of contention between external actors. This means, to my mind, restoring agency to the Ukrainian people, as well as restoring state sovereignty. The most important requirement for restoring agency is establishing social harmony between Eastern and Western Ukrainians. This will require both grassroots initiatives and government policies that recognize Malaros or Eastern Ukrainian culture as a legitimate part of Ukraine's indigenous diversity. The trade-off, which was actually quite effective in preserving the country's unity before 2004, is one familiar to anyone who has ever lived in a federal system. It is cultural autonomy for political loyalty. As for restoring sovereignty to Ukraine, while there are many possible ways to resolve the conflict now involving Russia, Ukraine, and the West, most are at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty. The best way to strengthen Ukraine's independence and allow it to develop a degree of immunity to foreign influence would be for Malaros Ukraine and Galician Ukraine to forge a common vision of the future by engaging in a process of national reconciliation. Forging such a common vision of the future, however, would require a repudiation of integral nationalism, the ideology that is at the very heart of Ukraine's post-Maidan political life. Only then could a patriotism that defines Ukraine as primarily a civic community take the place of ethnic nationalism. The terms nationalism and patriotism are often used interchangeably, when in fact they have very different historical origins and meanings. Whereas nationalism promotes social unity through exclusion, relying on inherited characteristics such as language, religion, and ethnicity, patriotism strives for social unity through inclusion based on characteristics that can be chosen, such as citizenship. The former typically leads to an ethnic polity, the latter to a civic polity. In a civic Ukraine, nationalists would have to move beyond their 1930s view that security for the country demands total cultural homogeneity, while Russophile Ukrainians in the East would have to prioritize their allegiance to the Ukrainian state, which would accept them as they are, rather than trying to change them. Both tasks rely on empathy to allay the fears of the other side and allow true dialogue to begin. Such a dialogue aimed at forging a shared, non-exclusive civic concept of Ukrainian identity might begin under the auspices of a Ukrainian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. By giving voice to the grievances of those who fought on either side of this conflict, it could become the modern-day equivalent of the Dionysian festivals of ancient Greece, offering riveting emotional testimony, highly choreographed and dramatized public spectacles, leading the public to catharsis, a purging of the soul that restores healthy perspective by removing hatred. It might seem like a tall order for Ukraine today, but we should not forget that such truth and reconciliation commissions have become powerful tools for social healing in more than 47 countries, once engulfed by hatred and civil conflict. An essential element of virtually all these commissions of this sort is the propagation of liberal values and human rights. Experience suggests that the best way to popularize such values in other countries is not to have them mimic Western models of thinking and governance, but rather to make people aware of their own liberal traditions, why it developed, and how it might respond to current challenges. Despite a rich 19th century liberal tradition, today Ukrainian liberalism has been totally eclipsed by Ukrainian nationalism, which sees not enough that is distinctively Ukrainian in it. This is only partly correct. The liberal intellectual tradition of the 19th century was indeed a heritage shared by both Russians and Ukrainians alike. But this is also precisely why it would be invaluable for establishing an inclusive, patriotic civic consensus, as well as forging new ties with both Russia and Europe on the basis of shared values. Of course, not all aspects of the truth and reconciliation process are appropriate for all situations. What worked in Spain or Guatemala might not work in Ukraine. Nevertheless, all successful models seem to have one thing in common. They begin with an interim and often imperfect peace settlement. The resulting lull in hostilities creates an opportunity for cooler heads to emerge who, over time, can forge longer-term solutions. Forgiveness and compassion require a calm social space where hatred can give way to dialogue and the healing of society begin. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu, chairman of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, put it, when it is implemented systematically, forgiveness becomes, as he put it, quote, thoroughly political. It is realpolitik, end quote. What are the prospects for social healing in Ukraine today? Admittedly, very slim. Given the passions aroused by Russia's invasion and the social and political influence that Ukrainian nationalists already exert, what incentive would they have to share power? Not much, I grant you, unless they believed that the nation's very survival was at stake. During the First World War, for example, Simeon Petlura agreed to cede all of Western Ukraine to Poland in exchange for Polish support against the Red Army. This triggered Western Ukraine's denunciation of Ukraine's first declaration of independence and resulted in the de facto disintegration of Ukraine. Today, however, Petlura is honored as a Ukrainian national hero. Near the end of the Second World War, in order to better cast their alliance with Nazi Germany as a struggle for Ukrainian independence, the leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists rewrote their charter and eliminated its most racially offensive and undemocratic portions. Likewise, in 1991, when it seemed that some regions of the country might not vote for independence, the leader of the nationalist Ruch movement, Vyacheslav Chernovil, embraced German-style federalism as the best option for Ukraine. And most recently, when faced with military collapse in 2015, former President Poroshenko agreed to autonomy for parts of Donbass in the Minsk Accords, even though, as his foreign minister Pavlo Klimkin now admits, this was just a ruse to gain time for the military to recuperate. Could we be looking at a similar situation today? It is at least conceivable that when confronted with the fact that their policies have led to the de facto partition of Ukraine, some nationalists might reconsider their assumption that cultural, religious, and linguistic monism is the only path to national unity and accept political diversity, political, I should say, loyalty in exchange for cultural diversity. This highlights the most important lesson of the tragic view of politics, namely that the pursuit of total victory over one's enemies can only breed renewed conflict. Herein lies a crucial difference between a partial revolution, one that is forever in search of perfect justice and is therefore forever doomed to repeat itself, and a revolution that has completed its cycle. Over time, the latter brings society to a point of healing and rest because it can acknowledge the suffering of those who opposed the revolution as part of a shared tragedy, rather than as a justification for more revolution and even more suffering. The current tragic cycle will therefore end when Ukrainians realize that a completed revolution is a revolution of compassion and dignity that allows all Ukrainians, regardless of religion, language, or cultural heritage, to be treated as essential members of the Ukrainian nation. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Dr. Petro. And for those of you in the audience who might have questions for him, please drop them in the Q&A feature, not in the chat, and we will pass those questions along. But I'll lead off. Just something. I'm a Middle East guy. I've read a fair bit about Ukraine from my time at the National Interest during the start of the Donbass War. And one of the things that I'm interested in hearing more about is the Ukrainian liberal tradition. I think the image that a lot of Americans might have is, this is a country that, maybe folks know about some of the stuff during World War I and World War II, but primarily it was part of the Soviet Union. It has a distinct identity. And then it's had this troubled period after the breakup of the Soviet Union, where it's kind of been trying to find its way and be pulled in two directions. What's the history here for the liberal tradition that you're speaking about from the 19th century?
From the middle of the 19th century through the early 20th century, in the Russian Empire, there was a strand of legal thinking first, and then it expanded into political philosophy as well, about what we would call today the essentials of liberalism. And although they used the term sporadically, it really revolved around the assertion of the primacy of the individual over the interests of society, which I think is a fair enough description of classical liberalism. It is the ability of the individual to stand alone, if necessary, against the state, and to have something in society to rely on as a justification of that. Not simply a moral standing, like, I'm a martyr, for example, for my cause, you might say. That's not liberalism. Liberalism is the ability to say, I, as a member of society, have these other institutions within society that will support me in my assertion of individual rights. That could be the law, it can be political diversity, it could be a lot of different things. And each country has something like that. There's every nation in the world, every major culture in the world has thinkers who have argued for that. And for Russia, the heyday, I should say the Russian Empire, the heyday of that, and that includes Ukraine, of course, the heyday of this was the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And its further development after that was, of course, broken by the Bolshevik Revolution, which turned the issue on its head and reasserted in a very totalitarian fashion the primacy of society as a whole. So I'm not going to go over all the names involved, but suffice it to say that a colleague of mine at the University of Ottawa, Paul Robinson, is right now finishing a manuscript on the subject of liberalism in Russia, which will be a nice addition to the literature on this subject, of which there is not much in English.
Yeah, and another thing you mentioned was federalism. You know, as an issue in Ukraine. I'd watched a few episodes of Zelensky's comedy show from back in the day, where he becomes president. And in one of the episodes, the night before he becomes president, his character's a history teacher, and his heroes, Plutarch and Herodotus, are standing over his bed talking about different paths he could go. And, you know, as he's sleeping, he's reacting to the different paths that they say. And one of them mentions federalism, and his hand leaps up and goes around the guy's neck. And so I'm curious, you know, to me that said something about how federalism might be perceived to some Ukrainians. How does that issue play within Ukraine? How is it seen as a solution or a danger?
Historically, federalism arose at the same time, simultaneously with the discussions of Ukrainian independence and statehood. We're talking about, as a political movement, the end of the 19th century. All the political movements that existed in Ukraine, most of which arose in the Western Austro-Hungarian part of the empire, but then had intellectual support in the major intellectual centers of the Russian Empire, Kiev, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. A certain support. So federalism emerged at the same time that the idea of a Ukrainian state and national, as a manifestation of its national identity, arose. The failure of that first attempt at the end to achieve independence at the end of the First World War led to disillusionment with the idea of federalism as well as liberalism, to which it was paired very often. And the counter-reaction in Ukraine was very much the same as the counter-reaction throughout all of Europe at the time, which was fascism. In other words, if you couldn't get your nation this way, let's try the fascist way. And look how well they're doing in Italy and Germany and Spain. And those were all classical successful examples, deemed so at the time by Henry Ford and by many others in this country as well as Europe at the time. It wasn't until it transformed into an aggressive phenomenon and resulted in World War II that fascism and Nazism were decisively disowned. However, that wasn't, I would say, the issue for many Ukrainian nationalists. Again, for them, the priority issue tended to be, we still don't have a country. We need to get a country. What mechanisms will allow us to get a country? And so intellectually, I think the discussions of nationalism and federalism stagnated, while the ability of a form of nationalism, including militant nationalism, to put people under arms and perhaps regain control that way, since it didn't look like the Soviet Union was going anywhere, that became more of a popular concept, particularly in the Ukrainian emigration. And plus, of course, they had their own fathers and grandfathers as models to look at, many of whom, escaped to the West and lived in Western countries, and were the core population around which the Ukrainian diaspora coalesced. Federalism was a topic and was advocated by many intellectuals after Ukrainian independence, because the issue of having for all intents and purposes, half the country looking to Russia, half the country looking to the West, how do we unite? How do we preserve our unity in this circumstance? Was always very troubling. And federalism is, in fact, from an objective perspective, the solution to exactly that problem. It's the solution in Belgium. It's the solution in Brazil. It's the solution in Mexico. It's the solution in a lot of countries that are federal systems. And the nice thing about federalism is that it doesn't have just one mechanism. It says the essence of federalism is there needs to be a negotiation between the center and a region to discern what the relationship between them should be, and what the limits of power of the central authority should be with respect to local authority. And it adds, the topic here that needs to be negotiated, typically in a federal system, is local identity, which may very often differ in some way from the standard, sort of the national standard as it's seen from the capital. But ever since the 2000s, or let's say 2004, when the first Ukrainian, I should say, strongly nationalist president, Viktor Yushchenko, was elected in the first Orange Revolution of 2004, with him, all that discussion was declared treasonous. So the argument is simply this, and it's been this way since 2004 to the present, and if anything, it's gotten more exaggerated. Namely, if you are recommending federalism, what will prevent a region from leaving? The weakness of this argument is that it assumes that the regions want to leave rather than that they want to stay. And of course, the nice thing I argue about federalism is that it does encourage the center to ask the question of, well, what can I do for these people to encourage them to remain where they are with us? And right now, the answer from the central authorities is suppression of your local language, suppression of your identity, suppression of your religious identity. And the results are what we have seen throughout the period of Ukrainian independence.
So we got a question from our audience from Mikhail Mikhailov, who asks if you could elaborate on how this conflict will impact the future of other conflicts in the region about cultural identity distinctions. He says, how will other post-Soviet countries react to the need to separate themselves from Russia's influence, or from, I suppose, the threat that Russia will step in to resolve their internal differences on Russian terms?
Hard to say. I mean, I think it'll probably, I would imagine that it would differ for countries that are in NATO like the Baltic states, that were formed part of the former Soviet Union, although we didn't recognize it, but it was de facto. And other nations which are not part of the Western Alliance. So I think for the Baltic states, they have essentially pursued policies that have, to some degree, disenfranchised the local Russian population. There are pros and cons to that from a national security standpoint. But I think I've argued that there's a school of thought called the Copenhagen School of International Security, because it's associated with scholars at the University of Copenhagen, that indeed minority national identities do not have to create tensions within nations. If one meets their basic needs, these do not necessarily have to burgeon into a full-blown conflict that later leads to civil war and secession, or secession, and if that is not done peaceably, then civil war. That solution has been avoided in most European countries. And so we should be thinking perhaps of exactly what those mechanisms are that has allowed these sorts of multinational, pluricultural systems to persist and survive and thrive in Europe. So for the rest of the former Soviet Union, outside of the Baltic states, I would say it's a combination of factors. Countries like Kazakhstan, maybe Kyrgyzstan as well, have substantial Russian populations that are highly concentrated. And like Ukraine, they mostly live and reside in cities, form part of the upper class, upper middle class intellectuals of those countries. I think the model to choose, again, is to look to Europe to anticipate and incorporate those people rather than antagonize them by limiting their access, their political rights and their civil rights. I think perhaps the Ukrainian example could show, could be a lesson in something to avoid in that respect.
Yeah, and just to go into a little bit more for our audience, could you talk a bit about what was going on in Ukraine in recent years that was, kind of pushing against Russian identity, Russian language, et cetera?
Well, it's not just recently, although again, it's more of a matter of intensity. So in 1991, at the time of independence, President Kravchuk ran on a national program that offered what he called his Russian compatriots in Ukraine full cooperation and joint, as he put it, joint ownership of the state. There was not to be any short shrifting of the rights that anybody had with respect to language or culture. And the Ukrainian Constitution, in Article 10, actually requires that the state support the ability of individual communities to express their cultural identity, and it specifically mentions Russian. At the same time, however, there's a parallel track or has been since independence, a parallel track of legislation that asserts that there is only one state language. It's called the state language, not called your mother tongue or native tongue. It's called the state language. And the state language must be Ukrainian. And in matters of state, only Ukrainian can be used. Well, then, as a legal matter, what is an issue of state? What is a matter of state? Well, at first it was only speeches, but then it became every public pronouncement. Then it became, as of last year, in private services, for example, when ordering at a restaurant, the waiter is obliged to speak to you in Ukrainian. Even if, like Odessa, it's a city where 90% of the people speak Russian, the waiter has to do this to you. And then you can ask the waiter, under the current law, to speak another language, presumably Russian. And then, however, you can only proceed in another language if both parties agree. It becomes very complicated. I saw an incident on national television in Ukraine a few weeks ago where the host was interviewing a specialist from Georgia, so the Republic of Georgia. And they were speaking Ukrainian in the audience, the host were, and they posed a question to the person from Georgia over the connection. And he said, well, I don't speak Ukrainian. Can we do it in Russian? Can you ask me in Russian? And he said, no, that's not allowed under our law. So the host of the television show asked someone in the audience to translate because it's illegal for the host of the television show to speak any other language. It becomes ridiculous. And everybody knows this, but they kind of pretend that by having these laws, people's preferences are changing. And we can see from statistics that we have as late as the end of last year on internet usage, the things that people download, that it's overwhelmingly still in the Russian language, even though it's been more than a decade since all educational institutions in Ukraine public educational institutions have been forced to transition entirely to the Ukrainian language.
So we've got another question from Steve Hooger, who says it seems that Putin may have overestimated how much Russophilic Ukrainians or Eastern Ukrainians generally would welcome his intervention. To what extent would you say the Russian invasion has had a unifying effect on opposing sides within Ukraine, or is that only transitory?
We don't know. That we can't predict. I can't predict the future, at least. I can say historically that whatever happens will not last in people's memories. That's human nature. In other words, the Civil War in America was a big deal through the 1880s and stuff like that. I mean, when people were alive, when they'd gone, and it affected people's attitudes. Today, not so much, Yes, at the University of Virginia where I went, we made all sorts of jokes about, the South and things like that, and the War of Northern Aggression. But those are silly jokes, okay? But those would have been fighting words in the 1880s. So just remember that everything passes. All things pass. And again, the examples I gave are ones that make you think. England and Ireland. Boy, two nations that hated each other. And you would think after the experience of Oliver Cromwell, I mean, Cromwell is still the bugbear for Ireland, for any Irishman today. And that was what, 300 years ago? The Mexican-American War, which General Ulysses Grant later said the American Civil War was God's punishment for the atrocities that we committed. Remember, we stole half of Mexican territory. Then we had 10 incursions afterwards into Mexican territory. And yet, people now retire in Mexico. We have Mexican immigrants working here. People cross the border. I'm just saying, it may not be in my lifetime. I'll grant you that. And emotions are always more intense during and immediately after military conflict. Even so, I grew up in Europe, in Germany and Italy. But every summer we would go, I would partly travel myself sometimes, to Holland. And I can tell you that a generation, when I was growing up, the older generation, many did not conceal in Holland their hatred and contempt for older generations of Germans. And sometimes it manifested itself in disrespect and things like that for people like myself crossing the border. But then 5 years later, it was not a big deal, or it seemed to have passed. So I would just say, I don't know. I think there is indeed, obviously, much more conflict now, much more hostility, but I would be wary of presuming to say that this kind of hatred can be sustained. It's just not been my experience that hatred of the kind of intensity that one feels in battle or around battle, that people are able, even as human beings, to sustain that for very long afterwards.
Another question we have from Fernando Estrella, who asks whether he thinks that further expansion of NATO, such as to Sweden and Finland, will make the situation worse and create a kind of justification for Russia, for Putin, et cetera.
I don't see it as changing much substantially. Russia has already decided, it seems, that NATO is a hostile alliance aimed at containing Russia. The ultimate objective of that containment is a regime change in Russia, or, if that's not possible or takes too long, the dismemberment of the country into some smaller group of states. So adding one or two more members to the 20 that are already there, you could argue it both ways as an analyst, couldn't you? You could say, well, it makes that organization stronger because there's more resources. On the other hand, does it add anything significantly new to those resources? Anything that Sweden and Finland didn't do before as unofficial allies of NATO, which they were already, integrated into all the essential defense mechanisms, just not having to contribute to the formal obligations of the alliance. Doesn't seem that it does. On the other hand, you could also argue that every new member added to NATO is a potential veto voice. Now, the United States can keep hurting all these disparate members and exert its influence, but there's also such a point of complexity at which it becomes unwieldy, unfeasible, and unmanageable to at least maybe maintain the fiction that every member of NATO has the same voice. On the eve, before the Russian invasion took place, the president of Croatia had already stated that if there was to be a conflict between NATO, of which Croatia is a member, with Russia, Croatia would withdraw its forces from this particular conflict because it didn't want to get involved. Of course, we know Hungary is very ambivalent about this. And now it seems Turkey has its own agenda. But again, all the balls in play, there are many balls in play here. For Turkey, it's not about Ukraine. For Turkey, it's about the militarization of the Western Aegean. You know, their beef is with Greece, and they want, for their vote, which they will probably give in favor of NATO expansion, they want to get something in return, and it's their agenda. Now multiply that by 20 different states, and you understand the problem.
So another question here, you spent time in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, and then again in 2021. And I'm curious if you noticed significant changes in the society and the politics across that time period.
So I spent every year in Ukraine, every summer. It's a little bit like watching the grass grow. I mean, yes, there are changes, but the changes, we did travel throughout East and West, but that was travel. The region we stayed in was the South, the city of Odessa. Odessa is, I would say, noticeably the most cosmopolitan part of Ukraine. It is also among the most Russified. So they are a Russian-speaking city, but they don't have a only Russian identity. For them, the Russian identity is part of their way of accessing the larger world, which is different, for example, from Lvov in the West, which has an entirely Ukrainian identity and is using that Ukrainian identity to say, well, we were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that's basically Austria, that's basically the West. So we're the West, okay? But their linguistic base for doing that is Ukrainian, which simply doesn't have the reach that the Russian language has, either in Ukraine or throughout the former Soviet Union or anywhere else in Eastern Europe. So in the city that we have visited annually for the last decade, the changes were minimal. But when they occurred because of government intervention. So everybody's listening to Russian radio until the government says, no more Russian radio, no more, by Russian radio, I mean radio in the Russian language, local radio in the Russian language. So that gets turned off overnight. Local television, always in Russian, local channels. National television, Ukrainian, local channels in Russian. That was okay until overnight, it's not. So that's what happens. How do people respond to that? Well, I guess, they just take it in stride for the most part. It's not like you can organize, you can't set up a pro-Russian political party. You can't, what can you do? The essential, there's the political forces you elected in locally, the political forces that they elected were the ones that supported ideas like federalism and better relations with Russia. But over time, in 2014, these used to be the most popular parties in the country. In 2014, they were abolished. Now again, their successor parties have all been abolished. So there literally is no political vehicle for you to use to promote your regional identity. And that's not a healthy situation. That actually causes even non-political people to kind of be frustrated, especially since there's now a language ombudsman who has the authority to fine individuals and businesses for any unauthorized use of the Russian language.
So another issue that you have followed closely, that you know a lot about, is the matter of the Russian Orthodox Church. And there's been a lot of talk about its relation to the Russian state, to this war, and also to its status within Ukraine, which I know there's been a lot of friction in the last few years about the direction of the church within Ukraine. Can you tell us a bit about all of that?
Well, it's a big topic, and I wrote an article about that in the last few years for the Yale Journal of International Affairs, which is available on my website. So you can download it if people are interested. So part of the movement for Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian national identity involves the establishment of a Ukrainian church, that is a Ukrainian national version of the larger Universal Orthodox Church, which is divided into different, mostly national territories. So with independence from the Soviet Union came a split among the hierarchy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church between those who wanted to establish immediately a Ukrainian Orthodox Church different or distinct from Russia, and those who said, well, why can't we just be part of one big church? We'll have our own administration, but we will pay due reverence in prayer to the head of, as we do to all patriarchs, the Patriarch of Moscow. And the latter course was chosen by the group called Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which in Ukraine is sometimes also designated with Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, as opposed to the group that established itself in the early 1990s called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kievan Patriarchate, so KP. And the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox, the Kievan Patriarchate, has long argued for recognition, but that recognition was not granted to the church by any other Orthodox church in the world. That situation changed in 2019 during President Poroshenko's unsuccessful campaign for president. He started negotiations with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is the first in seniority among Orthodox patriarchs, but he doesn't have the same authority or role as the Catholic Pope. He's just one among many, but the eldest, like an elder brother. And the Patriarch of Constantinople essentially made a deal with Poroshenko to offer his support, which means a lot, in recognition of the Kievan Patriarchate, if it united with some of the smaller churches, and then would recognize his supremacy over the Ukrainian jurisdiction. What's important to remember here is that the Ukrainian jurisdiction of the Kievan Patriarchate includes most Ukrainian churches in America and Canada. And that's where the money is for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kievan Patriarchate. And so this deal went through at the end of 2018 and there's a lot of fanfare for it. And the church that came out of that was called the OCU, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. However, the original Kievan Patriarch, Denisenko, said, well, we were still not independent. We've just switched our effective allegiance from Moscow, or what we were never aligned with Moscow, but this new church is just oriented toward Constantinople. We still don't have our church, and so he withdrew. As a result, the situation is just as confused as it has been for a long time. And as a result of that confusion and lack of unity, the rest of the Orthodox world has taken essentially a pause with respect to events in Ukraine until the churches that are in Ukraine, each of them claiming full mutually exclusive jurisdiction, can decide amongst themselves, what organizational structure they want to have. Outside of that Orthodox community are, of course, the Greek Catholics or Uniates, which are popular among the three Galician regions in the West. And there they are the majority. But Greek Catholics, their supremacy, their chief hierarch is the Pope of Rome.
Yes, and so just to close out, a question we try to ask all of our guests: what's one bit of advice that you would give to a young person looking to break into foreign policy who might want to follow in your footsteps or study the same kinds of things you do?
Well, I'm a little bit unusual in that I tried everything before settling on becoming a professor. As I was writing my dissertation, I did decide that I wanted a PhD, but I wasn't yet decided that I was going to be a professor, an academic. So I wrote my dissertation, I moved to Washington to do so in order to begin to make those contacts in case I was interested in a public service job. And that's very important, as I have learned over many years. To get a job in DC, you need to be in DC because they need to fill that place right now with a warm body. It's not about being the best or finding the perfect match. It's about getting somebody into a junior position right now. So you have to be there and available to do that. I then had the opportunity, as I was finishing my dissertation, to consider intelligence jobs, there are 20 different agencies, so there's a lot of variety, just even in that area. Then there's research functions, both public through the Library of Congress, and every branch has also a research aspect to it, be it in trade or agriculture or finances, international trade, things like that, and private think tanks. Now, it's very difficult as a junior person to get anywhere in the think tank world because they want big names. And you're likely to be exposed to interesting people as an intern or things like that, but that's not a career track that you can pursue. You have to do other things. So in the final analysis, I did get a chance to work mid-level as a policy advisor in the State Department. I spent more than a year lecturing to the intelligence community at all levels. While I was in DC and even afterwards, I would occasionally get invitations. I did the same thing more recently. The requests have come from the military to do the same thing. I mean, you're a Russia expert, you're a Ukraine expert, you have something unusual to say, let's hear it, that sort of thing. So I like that. I like that aspect of what I do now, because I ultimately chose academics because it offers the greatest flexibility and really is the only aspect of this work where the individual has control of their agenda. If you're in a private think tank, obviously your funders are telling you what they want you to be working on. If you're in government, your supervisor is telling you I need this report on this, now or in 2 weeks or however long it takes you. The only place where you can set your own agenda for years on end is literally the academic world. And that's ultimately why I chose it and why I recommend it. However, you do have to be self-motivated, and that you have to know whether you can drive yourself, because no one indeed is going to tell you you have to write or to publish here or there, but they will expect it. And if you don't do that, then you will be disappointed in your promotions and things like that. But luckily, again, unlike a lot of jobs where you get evaluated every year or something like that, after 7 years of evaluation, you have tenure, which means you have a guaranteed job for life. And at that point, you can essentially set your own agenda and decide to do really something completely different if you want.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Nicolai Petro for speaking to us tonight about the situation in Ukraine and some possible ways to resolve the fissures in that society. Thank you again to everybody for attending. We will see you next week for another discussion about the prospects for resolving the conflict in Ukraine. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.